Much once more, and we are here, Erik is here now for questions. So maybe I would start. So I still remember the time when palm oil was said that it's perfect, yeah, and that everybody should use it, that it's healthy, and it's tropical fat, and so on. And then in turn, suddenly to this really bad reputation. So could you tell us a little bit about this change, how it was in, because it was quite rapid, no?
Yeah, I think, I mean, palm oil didn't really start until the 1970s. Before that, it wasn't really there much as a commercial crop. It was there a little bit. And I mean, the stories that are being told is that the producers of higher latitude oils, so rapeseed and sunflower, they became quite worried about the rapid growth in palm oil as a high-yielding crop, and they started putting out stories about tropical deforestation and orangutans. And I think that once media started to pick up on that, it became a good narrative. And there's money associated with that, so if you wanted to fight palm oil, you could get money as an NGO, so there was, and it just sort of strengthened each other. There are stories, there's money behind the stories, so there's more people telling the stories. The media are generally not very critical, and they just follow the stories, and before you knew it, we had sort of this narrative around palm oil that no one seemed to question.
That's better.
There you go. Yeah. So I think that sort of started it, and it wasn't until probably 5 or 10 years ago that people started to look for a more nuanced way of looking at these issues. I mean, I can't judge whether this was intentionally done by big industries and big producers. It wouldn't surprise me if it had happened that way, but I don't know for sure. But indeed, it was quite rapid, and maybe these things are just kind of cultural. I mean, we all grew up being told that we had to drink more milk. Also to do with the fact that Europe had a massive milk lake and butter mountain, I think we called it. That we produced so much milk and butter, and then suddenly everyone started saying, well, butter and milk are really good for you, so consume more of it. So I think there's always that interaction between industrial interest and financial interest, and the narratives around these issues.
Okay, so Hamza.
I'm having several questions, but related to this, I don't want to deny that media is selective, and that the facts behind might be quite different. But could it be part of this story of palm oil that it was fields were made on new land, which was forested before, even though and in contrast, most of soybean and other oils were already planted where the fields were even before. Even though you said that soybean, for instance, is also increasing. So I guess part of this might be that it was related to deforestation.
Well, I mean, oil palm is very visible. It was on the news all the time in Indonesia, massive fires, large-scale deforestation, oil palm coming in, very stark. The only thing as a scientist that I know is that we've quantified this deforestation process quite well for oil palm. We haven't really done it for any of the other crops. It's done quite well for soybean, especially the link between Amazonian deforestation and soybean expansion is quite well understood. But there are no global high-resolution maps for rapeseed or sunflower. So, I mean, ultimately, of course, it's about time. I mean, all agriculture currently sits on land that was at some stage allocated to, at some stage was natural ecosystem. For our European agriculture system, the land clearing maybe happened 1,000 years ago. Coconut maybe happened 200 years ago, and soybean and palm oil is happening now. I can see that that's a difference. I mean, you want to fight the stuff that's going wrong now. You want to, and that's why the focus should also be on palm oil. But it is a little bit more nuanced because, I mean, one part of the story, of course, is the socioeconomics of the whole development. These new oil crops are developing in the poorest parts of the world, where it's generating opportunities for people. And if you look at sort of sustainable development goals, how do you weigh up environmental impacts against opportunities for reducing hunger and poverty? And I think it's better to have this discussion at the global level, where we don't just look at avoiding further impacts on existing natural ecosystem, but we're also looking from our own side at restoring some of what we've lost in places like Europe and the Americas, Northern America. I mean, I fly over Europe and I see mostly agriculture, and I know that it would, from an environmental point of view, be much better if at least some of that was restored to natural conditions, even if that means producing less agricultural output. So I think in terms of equitability, I don't like that kind of finger being pointed at tropical countries, having been based in the tropics myself for such a long time, where we tell these people, you should stop that and you should do this, and we're not willing to change anything ourselves. We tell them to make that change, and that's what's bothering me. Can we have an equal and equitable discussion about that? That we all need to, if that U-turn is something to believe in, we all need to change. We need to change the way we consume, the way we eat, the way we live on our land. And we shouldn't just ask someone else to make those changes because we're quite happy with the way we live. I don't think that's going to work that way. So yeah, you're right. I mean, these changes have played out over different time frames. But it doesn't mean that we could sort of step back from that discussion and say, well, what can we do to correct some of the wrongs that we've done ourselves?
Next question.
I was surprised by questionings about the boundaries in the first part of the lecture. I think definitely there are boundaries, some boundaries should exist. And maybe this questioning is motivated or connected with the development during the last 100 years, when there are more people on the planet and still they are more rich and more healthy and so on. So it seems like maybe the boundaries are still like developing or moving, but still I think even so it seems to be there should be some limit there. So
yeah, I mean that's why I put that slide up. I think, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about whether these boundaries exist and whether there is such thing as a tipping point when you have a system change to something completely different. I think it's, as you say, it's quite natural that there are boundaries, that we can only push the system to a certain point, and beyond that, things are going to look quite different. Whether it's like ecological collapse of ecological systems because of reduced diversity, it may not be easy to draw those boundaries, and they're very context dependent. But the idea of boundaries themselves, I think probably is correct, but not everyone agrees. It's quite a big debate. Yeah, I don't know what, from an ecological point of view, is there something to be said for boundaries to exist beyond which things kind of collapse?
They should be. However, what I had in mind, like watching this graph, that probably there are interactions here that we cannot separate them to. This one is one axis and totally independent to the other, because there would be like many interactions of them, and the whole complexity cannot be reduced to 10 axes which are independent. So we are 80% on these, but we are safe in these. So I don't trust it yet.
And there's tension there. I mean, people like talking about these things because they're good storylines, and you can tell people like, you need to be very careful with that boundary, and therefore you need to do this, which might help in politics. it might not always work like that in science. So, sorry, you have another question?
I just wanted to add that it's, on the other hand, we are still like continuously pushing these boundaries, it seems. So like, what is the limit of these boundaries? How much they could push our development?
Once we will know when we
That's exactly what I was thinking. Once the boundary snaps and you say,
Now we know it's
yeah. Yeah, we may not want to go there. Yeah.
my one also. You told me focus on oils and food production, but some part of it and in some oils it's might be quite significant. It's also used for is used in industry.
Yeah.
And how would they change the picture?
No, that's a good point. Like soybean doesn't produce that much oil, but of course most of soybean is used for feeding animals, pork, pigs, and cattle mostly, and chickens. And that complicates things, and that's actually the case for other oil crops. Rapeseed as well is for cattle feed and pigs. Coconut, of course, has other uses. Cotton is mostly used for clothes, not for oil. I'm just looking at it from an oil perspective, and I know that certain crops can only produce that much oil, and there needs to be a certain production to meet the overall demand. And then these questions of relative yields do become important, because you cannot push soybean to produce more oil. That's just not the kind of plant for that, I think. So I think it is important. This has been a critique of the work that we're doing on yields, that it's not quite relevant, because soybean also produces other things apart from oil. And then I take it back, say, yeah, but we're looking at it from an oil perspective, that oil demand will be there, and that oil production needs to happen somewhere through certain crops, and then the yield I think is relevant.
What I meant even oil is not used only for food, but
I
also
see.
used in the industry.
Yeah. Oh, the oil use itself. Yeah. So it's used, of course, for biofuel is a big one. A lot of oil is used in soaps, surfactants, oleochemicals, all sorts of other side products. I'm just looking at it from the food perspective.
They wrap it all together. How would that change the overall picture?
Well, make it even more complicated, because they well, you end up in discussions then, do we need biofuel? Is biofuel, is that a good idea? Do we want to use plants to produce fuel to run the machines that we have, or do we rely on mineral oils, on normal oil sources, or other forms of different forms of energy? So it just complicates it even more. I mean, I've written about biofuel use. It's very, very complicated. Yeah. So in this case, I just look at it from a food production point of view. Yeah.
Next question, sorry, the first one.
Okay, should I start? We had an interesting question online. David Novak is asking whether is there any difference in perceiving autarkic problematic oil plants between new and old world.
So you didn't catch that?
Whether there is difference, what crops, what oil producing crops are considered problematic in Americas and in Europe or
Asia and Africa.
Whether is there difference?
You mean from a local perspective, whether how people look at different oils produced locally? I don't know that much about it. We did a global perception study recently, and unsurprisingly, people in the Americas like soybean, and people in Africa like peanuts, and people around the Mediterranean like olive oil. So that's what I'm saying.
You don't like grape seeds.
grape seeds.
For some reasons, local reasons.
And yeah, I mean, we've asked people what their concerns are and why they choose certain oils, and environment and social impacts are very, very low. What people are worried about is health impacts, taste and price. And whatever meets those requirements locally, they'll buy that. That's kind of the big picture. So despite all the discussions about environmental impact, when people go to the supermarket, they buy oil because it's taste they like, health perspectives, or because it's cheap and they can afford it. So there seems to be a bit of a double standard there. We seem to get very hot-headed about the environmental impacts, but it doesn't actually influence what we buy in the supermarkets.
I would like to ask about the fat gap that you mentioned.
Uh-huh.
I can imagine that somehow technologically or scientifically it can be possible to solve the problem of those people who don't have sufficient amount of fat. But I'm skeptical about reducing the amount of fat that eat those people who have more than is enough. And so I would like to ask if you have any idea how this can be achieved, because I would think that it is kind of biological determination that every organism wants to, or wants, it's not the best word, but somehow tries to maximize the amount of resources that it takes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if this isn't some kind of evolutionary threat that since it is possible, we will just acquire it. So, just this.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is fat tastes good, doesn't it? Especially the combination of fat and sugar tastes very good. So, and I guess as human beings, we've evolved in a way that the humans have been named fat hunters. Basically, in our evolution, we were hunting for fat. That's when I used to work in longhouses in Borneo. They would go hunt the pigs, and they would always give me the best part of the pig as the guest of honor, which is the skin. It's basically a layer of fat, but the hair still sticking up, and they were chewing away on pork steak. Fat is what we want. So I guess this is a major question: how do you get people to reduce fat intake when we're evolutionarily probably programmed to maximize fat intake? That is very counterintuitive. Yeah, that's one tricky part. The other tricky part is how you get more fats to people that actually need it and can't get access to. So both are part of closing the fat gap. Closing the fat gap is not just getting people that don't have enough fats to eat more fats, but also to reduce it in people, and both are tricky. Funny enough, I mean, I can't find anything about dietary guidelines for malnourished people and the role of fat in it. It just doesn't seem to be any sort of, even the WHO and the FAO just don't say anything, which, considering it's such a rich source of dense calories, we have very little, unless I've overlooked it, to say about that idea. Does that answer your question? Sorry? Yeah? Yeah, okay.
So next question.
I have two questions. One that follows this one. And so, when you were talking about the fat gap, you mentioned we need this much more fat to get to what we need.
Mm-hmm.
But is that already, like, how much fat can we reduce when people have too much fat? Like, is it the amount of fat that we eat? Did you already subtract the amount of fat that we have as home still on the people that eat too much fats? Or is that just looking at the fats we need to add to the people that don't have enough fats and not touching the fats of people that have too many fats?
The fat gap discussion requires that the people that, or closing the fat gap, people that consume too much fat reduce fat. So it's a net calculation.
So if those people don't reduce the fats, we will need even more fat added than you had here on the slides.
I don't know. That's a good question. How does the fat gap work? I mean, you certainly have people that need more fat, so you need to produce more fat. If people that should reduce it don't reduce it, what happens? Good question. I don't have an answer. I need to think about that.
And the second one was that you showed with your pictures and with your graphs that olive oil can be very efficient, can be very good crop. And I feel like the public opinion is mainly about the location where olive oil is made and is harvested now. Could olive oil as a crop be grown at other parts could be planted at parts that now have a different oil crop, and replace those oil crops, not so much replace the forests or replace natural habitats, and like, because just more efficient than crops that are currently there.
Potentially, I guess, and I guess genetic improvement could help a lot. But the practicalities are actually quite difficult. So oil palm originates from Western Africa, and they've been trying to commercialize production of. So most palm oil in Western Africa is produced in smallholder setting, agroforestry type setting. There's a few plantations, but not very much. And many companies have tried, and one of the problems with oil palm is very labor intensive, so you need a lot of people that are willing to do hard labor in agricultural lands, and they just haven't really succeeded. The infrastructure in Africa, the financing infrastructure, the milling capacity, the human capacity or the human willingness to work plantations hasn't been there. It's been more successful in South America. Colombia is quite a strong upcoming palm oil industry, mostly developed on existing bare lands. So Brazil has never really taken off. So I think it's possible, but soybean is a huge crop with massive fields, huge machines that so probably like one farm is like run by 2 or 3 people. Oil palm, the plantations where I work, there's like 5,000 people in a plantation. So they're really quite different crops, not just from where they're grown, but also how they're grown. And I think that really becomes, you can probably only grow oil palm which is tropical in areas with the right bioclimatic conditions, of course, but also with the right human conditions, like the people that actually want to work there. So it's been tried, but not very successfully.
Okay, because from what I saw, that would be a narrative that the public might accept more easily than, hey, oil palm is not that bad, so let's eat it. I'm not saying that's a narrative you're selling, but...
Well, I mean, that's why I want people to have an objective look at palm oil. I mean, it does produce a lot more oil, and that oil is needed than other crops. So can we, because at the moment, like the EU is putting policies in place that's not banning the use of palm oil, but it's seriously restricting the use of palm oil. The EU is thinking of also doing that with soybean, and then so we produce our own oils on our own land. Well, yeah, I mean, you're talking much lower yields. And it's not like we have so much agricultural land left in Europe. I mean, so can we have a bit of a debate about this? And I think politicians also, if we as scientists don't have the answers, politicians won't have the answers, and then they take decisions that are based on poor information, and that's where you can make big mistakes. I mean, banning crops from the tropics just because we don't like the deforestation that may or may not be associated with it, and then think we do it ourselves, I think that could be a real trouble for Europe. At least if you care about the environment.
It would be neat, but should we take into calculation also the price of transportation? And then it would really make sense for us to stay on rapeseed oil, and even though we might not like it the most, but it's local.
Yeah, it's a different discussion, and certainly in terms of price. I mean, transportation cost is a big part of the price of food. I'm not always convinced that local is best. Tomatoes grown in the Netherlands really taste bad because they never see any sun. They're sitting in greenhouses, and greenhouses require a lot of energy to keep warm. The stuff I've read about, sometimes it's better to fly tomatoes from Greece to Holland in terms of carbon footprints and so on. They're trying to grow them locally. So it depends a little bit on each crop. But for meeting, you'd have to do your calculation. How big is the population size of the European Union? What would fat demands be, either if you close the fat gap or you just keep people from consuming what they're consuming now? And what would it look like if you stopped using any oil crops from outside the European Union? you could probably do a back of the envelope calculation of how much land would be needed to be allocated to the production of oil locally.
Or it would just increase prices to such amount.
It would increase prices, yeah. Production here is more expensive than in the tropics. Maybe not a concern for many people, but certainly a concern for some people. Yeah.
So I have a question, like thinking about your comparison of productivity was in like kilojoule per hectare per year, yeah? Something like this. And no, I have other questions. So I'm thinking, what is like behind this high productivity of oil palm? So probably part is that it grows in tropics where the temperature is high, so the metabolic rate is higher. So that's, if it is per year, so it means because it has high temperature all the year around. Second, probably because it's from moist environment, so, and that confines it to pressure tropical areas. Yes, so that's the problem that was discussed. And maybe like more efficient photosynthesis, but is there anything else behind it, or these three factors?
Well, the thing you said that oil palm is used almost entirely for the production of oil. So you have the oil fruits, the mesocarp is used for palm oil, then the kernel is used for palm kernel oil. Everything goes to oil, apart from what can be used, and that goes to compost. Whereas with other crops, soybean is mostly used for meal that gets turned into animal feed. So it's partly that, but yeah, productivity is probably high in tropical areas. And I don't know to what extent that relates to the fact that there are annual and perennial crops. Don't know whether that means.
I mean that it is C4, no, probably. Like I think photosynthesis, which is more efficient in high temperature, high sunlight. So that's probably part of the.
But from the industrial perspective, it doesn't matter actually. I mean, it's an interesting question for you as ecologists, but for industrial production, the efficiency is the most important.
Yeah, and I mean, each oil has different chemical characteristics. So oils are quite interchangeable, but not 100% interchangeable. One of the advantages of palm oil is that it stays liquid at room temperatures, which is something that producers like for I don't know what reasons, but there are differences between these oils that are important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was actually wondering about this slide with the productivity of all oils. And palm oil was by far the best, but the grape oil and sunflower oil was also very quite good compared to a lot of other oils. So that kind of goes against the fact that the oils. And so that kind of goes against the fact that the oils grown in the tropics are the better ones, because those two are oils that are grown here in temperate zones.
Yeah, it's not really a tropical thing. I mean, palm oil indeed is a tropical crop here at the bottom, but sunflower seeds is I think generally it's quite drought resistant. It's generally grown in drier parts of the world. Sunflower, rape and mustard is a high latitude crop, so
like steppes.
Yeah.
Ukraine.
I think it's a good question for Doug Scheel when he is here next week. He would probably have a better answer. He knows it quite well. But indeed, there doesn't seem to be a very clear latitudinal trend in the productivities of these different oils. But there's also, I mean, these are averages. Like oil palm generally produces about 4 tons of oil per hectare. But there are varieties that produce 18 tons per hectare. So the big question for me is how can we increase productivity of these crops on the existing land? You don't want to have any land expansion ideally, but yield increases. But then you go into things like fertilization, nitrogen, phosphorus use, and so on. That has its own impacts again. So it's all about quality of management, micromanagement of fertilization, micromanagement of pesticides and herbicides, soil health, water use, just better production in general for all crops.
Okay, so if there is any question or comment or from online, no? Okay, so is there any crucial question or comment now? If not,
it's now or never.
Thanks.